For the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about the important gap that sits at the heart of our practice, the gap between my life as I would like it to be and the reality of my life as it is, and the tension, the dis-ease, the pain that we feel at the perception of that gap, just our resistance to our life as it is. And of course, what we always recommend is coming back to the body, to our body's experience. And we know, because we've been told over and over and over and over again, that it's really important to have a non-judgmental attitude towards this. And in fact, in some respects, mindfulness is defined as, continuous non-judgmental awareness. This is important. But what do we mean by non-judgmental, and is there a problem with the non-judgmental attitude itself? There's a beautiful version of the morning chant in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition, which just has the line, "No more right or wrong," which is hard to get your head around, but once you do, you can see about this. We're replacing that with ideas of wholesomeness and unwholesomeness, though in another way, maybe that's reintroducing the idea of right and wrong. And clearly, if we're all being kind, if we're all being friendly with each other, then the last thing we would want to be thought of doing is judging each other. We don't want to be judged. Why should we judge the other? And if I say judgment, we have the phrase, don't we? Oh, you're just being judgy, but let's put that aside for one moment. If we think about actual judgment, then whoa, maybe that's the judgment of God or the judgment of the court. That's serious. We certainly don't want that. And so, we'll be non-judgmental. And yet, in a sense, when we adopt this attitude, we're deliberately drawing back, cutting ourselves off from the full, immediate complexity, the mess of our lives as we are. And there's a real reason why we do this, and it's useful. But if we're all the time thinking about our life in terms of separating out different parts of me, or separating out me and you, or separating out us from them, there's a problem here. And in fact, if we're hoping not to separate out from each other by being non-judgmental, there's a danger too that we end up just sitting in our little silos as individuals. Yeah, I'm over here, you're over there. We won't get in each other's way. That's fine. So what's positive, what's good about the non-judgmental attitude? Quite a lot, actually, obviously. Otherwise we wouldn't say, this is the basis of it. What happens when we do start to judge? Yes, this is the important bit, isn't it? What happens when we do start to judge? Well, we stop, because there's a judgment being made, and that very often is a judgment on me. My fault, I'm so bad. What? Or if we're not doing that, we're probably judging somebody else. It was their fault, nothing to do with me, absolutely. And so on. And we're using this as a way to escape the direct experience of this body, how it actually feels, to be actually feeling this emotion, where it's coming from, how it shows up in me as this tension, this red face, this whatever. And that's very important and very powerful. And beyond that, what's happening when we're judging? Well, we're stopping, we're closing off. Two ways we can think of this quite usefully, I think. One of which is what happens when you call somebody evil. Say, Hitler was evil. Oh yeah, that's the end of it, isn't it? We don't need to think anymore. We've just nice label. And we talked about this in relationship to some of the precepts. We're closing off. We don't need to say anymore. We've judged. Stamp. Done. And of course, our practice is about never closing off. It's about never stopping that process, but letting it work through, letting it run its course, show us what we didn't see, let us feel what we had no idea we felt beforehand. And of course, one of the things which often arises with judgment, if it's to do with us, is shame. And shame we hate. And shame itself is shaming. And we certainly don't want to go there. But as soon as we start feeling shame, bang, process over. Either we zone out, we go away and do something else, or we just sit there in the full agony of our shame. And we could just actually experience that neutrally and being non-judgmental about feeling our shame, which might actually be quite a good thing. How does shame feel in this body? It's horrible. I hate it. And what does that link to? And why am I actually feeling this about that? And so on. But the whole point and the problem with judgment in a sense is when it's about closure. And closure is always separating off, the end of a conversation, the end of a series of emotions. And clearly, therefore, most of the time, when we're judging others, it is exactly in order to separate off from them. We're the good guys. We're the Buddhists, or we're the people who think straight. We're the people who approve this and damn that. Us and them. And that's normally what we're doing with judgment. I'm right, you're wrong, I'm over here, you're over there. So, separation. And if we think at a more kind of intellectual level, this is about relativism, isn't it? It's all fine, you can do your thing, I'll do mine, we don't need to get in each other's way, that's okay. But that's not separate. And if we think, well, actually, yeah, a couple of interesting phrases from the Bible. I should have mentioned this one earlier. Judge not, lest ye be judged. That's one we carry around with us. Nobody wants to be judged. And yet, against that, we can put against this classic phrase, am I my brother's keeper? Question, with the implication, well, yeah, to an extent I am, because this is the world we share. This is the world we exist in. And most of the approach that I've been taking to teaching Zen is about recognizing our interrelationship, recognizing our interdependence. There's nowhere I can be actually on my own, because I exist only because of other people. Myself emerges out of my relationships. That's something we keep coming back to in different ways. And if we understand, or if we begin to understand, begin to experience that sense of real interrelationship, maybe we think about another phrase from the Bible, do unto others as you would be done by, in a different kind of way too. Again, that's not just, kind of contractual. If you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. That's recognizing our interdependence. We're human beings, or sentient beings. Let's actually include the animals. We're sentient beings. We experience suffering. This is what basically our practice is all about. How we work with this, how we live with this. The way I can understand your pain, your suffering, your disease, your confusion is because of mine. Otherwise, I'm lost. And vice versa, obviously. We share. We are part of this world that we share. So actually, if we're going to try and live a life that is more not separate whether that's in the way that we understand the world by getting clever with the Heart Sutra, whether that's the world we actually experience it in terms of our emotions, whether that actually relates to the way that we live our lives in our actions and how we genuinely are when we interact and relate with each other. Well, we're encouraged to think in an individualized, atomized way. And actually, this is one way we can distinguish most mindfulness practice, as it's generally practiced, sold, touted, whatever, and something like Zen. It's not fundamentally for me, it's not fundamentally about me. It's not part of my well-being. Well, it obviously is part of my well-being, but that's not its primary function, that's not its goal. It's to find a way to actually exist in this world with each other. So in that sense, we can say the non-judgmental attitude is absolutely essential because it's a powerful tool. But there are times we do judge, times we have to judge. And then the questions become, and they emerge directly out of our practice, they get really interesting because then it's, well, what next? What happens next? And then what? What do I want out of this judgment? What's the implication behind this judgment? Why am I making it? And how does that connect up with the whole of life, the whole of the situation, my relationships? Am I doing this to close down myself, you? Am I doing this because something needs to be done, something needs to happen? Now, one of the classic stories about Joko Beck, sort of in this context, but you see why I'm going there, is she's walking along the beach and she's, not a young lady, grey hair, doing a morning exercise. Sees two guys fighting over there and they're really taking chunks out of each other, and without thinking, no judgment involved, without thinking, she rushes over and yells, "Stop!" pushing them apart, and they scuttle off looking rather sheepish. Fantastic, lovely, And in Zen we have this idea of spontaneity, Wu Wei in Chinese. It just flows, it's just all flow. But lovely as that idea is, how does it relate to actual complex situations? And doing this talk in this way this evening comes directly out of some of the questions we had to do with last week's talk. How do I respond? What is the appropriate action if I see a policeman beating somebody up, or if that person is me? Or if I see somebody that looks like they're breaking into that house and want to burgle it? What do I do? What's the response? Or even if I'm hearing about something, some dreadful injustice on the news, and I'm making judgments about that. Clearly, this is wrong. This should change. I'm going to say, no. I'm going to make a judgment. So the question becomes, what do we want of our judgments? And how does that frame my response? Do I want an action as a result? Is there a process that this judgment is part of? Or am I just using it to close something down? To go back to the police example, we know that if the policeman who murdered George Floyd hadn't been filmed, if there hadn't been people there willing to do that and just stay for the whole time and film it and put that film out on media, Black Lives Matter would never have happened. Certainly wouldn't have happened in that way. Was that the right response? Should somebody have just rushed in? Maybe been shot? Should we walk on past? These are all questions which kind of at one level are just asking us about our, immediate responses and our feelings to things. But at the same time, they begin to ask us, well, when we are making judgments, what are we wanting? Often, of course, it's to reassure myself, to firm up my opinion of myself, to distance myself from somebody else. And in that sense, there's always a potential problem there because, the precepts as we work with them tell us, if we're using our preconceptions, if we're not paying adequate attention because we're predisposed to look at a situation in a certain way, if we're just going with received truths about things, then our judgments are probably going to be framed in terms of closure. Well, that's what people like that do. And if we want to talk about the policeman beating somebody up or the burglar burgling, are we going to say, yeah, they're bad people and leave it at that? And of course, when we want to deflect criticism from a system, what do we say? Few bad apples. Same with the burglar. Are we going to ask about how does our society create burglars? How does our society create policemen who think it's fine to beat people, often black people, sometimes shoot them? How does our society produce this situation? And that's when our judgment can begin to become a process of opening. Maybe we found out it's more complex than we imagined it was. Maybe we finally fall back on some kind of, people like that are like that, aren't they? But again, if Buddhism is always asking us to consider things from the point of view of emptiness, that there is no fixed me. I'm a different me in so many different situations, and that changes over time, then the idea of me nailing me to being a particular kind of person begins to seem increasingly absurd. If we know it's all about causes and conditions, how things interact with each other, if we know that if we change the conditions, we change the outcomes, then we might want to talk more about structures, about situations. Clearly, all of this is complex, and just always blaming it on individuals, that's the easy answer, isn't it? Or even the system. I grew up with the idea of the system which was out to get you. But again, as a kind of bland overall concept, that's useless, isn't it? And you can see how it's so easy to jump from just reflexive attitudes like that to something like QAnon. We look for easy answers to complex questions. It's their fault. And once we begin to make up stories and we embroider the stories, we've got a perfect world of right and wrong and light and dark. Except curiously, people seem to end up on the wrong sides in our minds very often. And there is a kind of fundamental question which our practice asks us to ask about the world, and which a lot of our precept work is really about exploring, is this suffering? Is this shaming? Are the things that we feel motivated to call evil, bad, wrong, Are they just the residual effects of a world that is basically going as well as it can? Or are they actually constitutive of the real problems that frame our society? Inequality, injustice, oppression, domination. And the way those show up in the all too familiar forms of misogyny, racism, inequality, etc., etc., etc. So there's a big gap between going, yeah, it's fine, we just need to mind our own corner, keep our own peace, not get in each other's way, or something like Dr. King's speech about, I have a dream. Things could be different. We could do things better. It's not tinkering, it's fundamental mindset. Changing the world, whether that's in a minor or major way, requires judgment. And it requires insight about the way that we are judging. Whether we're judging to close down and separate out, or whether we're judging to start a process that includes, that's not going to damn the others, that's not going to simply label them as bad or evil, but can come from a place of non-separation, of inclusion. This is our world, this is our society. Joko sometimes talks of it almost as coming from a place of love, and perhaps that's a bit strong. Perhaps even kindness is a bit strong. But we have to include all of us in our care about the world, our care for the world. The people who we think are getting it right and the people who we're damn sure are getting it wrong, because we're all in this together. So when we do find ourselves judging somebody as bad, evil, wrong, what do we want to happen? Do we want them to disappear from the planet? Do we want them killed, locked up? Do we want them dragged through the streets? Do we want them to experience shame, experience pain? Or do we simply want a world in which they can act differently? We talk about saving all beings in our practice, and I think this is, quite important as an idea. It begins with me, and unless I have a reasonable idea about how I'm going about this in my life, in each moment of my life, it's not a question of big things always, it's a question of micro things very often. Most of our life is tiny decisions. This, that. Is this towards a world with less suffering? Or towards a world where, things can rattle on, people can get hurt, I can get hurt. It's the way it is. So let's, when it's appropriate, let's be non-judgmental. Let's hold that non-judgmental attitude. Use it as the profound, deep tool that it is for our practice. But let's also see that leading a whole life requires judgment, but it requires insight. Why am I making this judgment? Where am I coming from? And what do I want from this judgment? What's supposed to be the outcome? And is this tearing us apart? Or trying to hold us together? Whether that's saying yes or saying no. Not separate.